Hi guys! So last week we spent some time looking at personality, what it is, what the key traits are, how people develop them, how they influence their behaviour, which is crucially important in understanding human thoughts and behaviour. However, as people that are all on a sports course, your particular interest is likely to be in how these things link to sport and exercise participation and performance, and we're going to spend a little bit of time looking at that this week. So, just a quick recap, that's Hollander's model of personality. So, our basic personality, our key traits, can't actually be seen by other people, but they infer them from how we generally behave. But remember, behaviour is often influenced by the situation that we're in because we engage in role play. And these are the big five personality traits that seem to pretty much underlie most human behaviours. Remember the acronym OCEAN. So, what are we going to do? Well, we're going to spend some time looking at personality traits and how they might influence sports participation and performance. We'll look at the research on this, and we're going to spend some time looking at personality testing in sport and how useful it is and how ethical it is a bit later on. There's a big argument in sports psychology between what are called credulous and skeptical sports psychologists. Now, credulous sports psychologists argue that we can use personality to predict what sports people are likely to play and how well they're likely to perform. But this is very controversial, and it's an argument that's raged for half a century. Some sports psychs are big believers in understanding people's personalities, and others aren't. So let's have a look at the evidence on this, and you can make up your own mind. So, skeptical psychologists argue that knowing about someone's personality doesn't tell you a lot about their behaviour. There's a lack of consistent trends in the research. They're quite critical of some of the research designs used, particularly due to quite small samples, quite small numbers of people being tested, and often there's a lack of theory underlying why we would expect to see personality differences. On the other hand, credulous sports psychologists argue that you can use personality data to predict success. So, should personality tests be used? Well, there certainly have been some really bad experiences in sport. I'm not going to talk a lot about this one because we'll explore it in a seminar where I can give you some quite juicy details of it. But essentially, players in the past have, for example, been subject to the use of tests to select them for teams and squads. And when this was done in the NFL a few years back, players actually nearly went on strike because of it, because they were so annoyed about it and they felt they were being misused. But on the other hand, so should we use personality tests to select players? Well, there might be arguments for and against that, but one thing we do know is that personality does seem to link to sport in a number of ways. There's a lot of research showing, for instance, that athletes tend to be more extroverted than non-athletes and lower in neuroticism. Eysenck himself, who was a big football fan, did a big study in the early 80s on this, and this has been replicated a number of times. In general, athletes seem to score higher in extroversion and lower in neuroticism than non-athletes. Interestingly, we also find greater similarities at a high level in sport in terms of personality profile than at a low level, presumably because if certain traits are important to performance, people who don't have them tend to drop out rather, as we move up the performance pyramid, leaving the people with the traits that are needed for success. What those might be, we'll have a little look at in a moment. But another thing we need to bear in mind is that perhaps different personalities suit different sports. So, not surprisingly, team sport athletes tend to be more extroverted than non athletes, and people who play high risk sports tend to be more extroverted and lower in conscientiousness, interestingly, than athletes in low risk sports. So there is evidence that personality test scores can discriminate between people playing different sports. There is genuinely some evidence to support the idea that, on average, for instance, people that play certain individual sports where you might train on your own a lot, like the long distance runner, do tend to score lower in extroversion than team sport athletes. It sounds like a terrible stereotype, but it's true. There's even differences within sports. So some studies have suggested that athletes in offensive positions are better at controlling anxiety than athletes in defense. Also evidence that our offensive athletes tend to be higher in extroversion. However, those studies had quite small samples, and a more recent study with a big sample didn't support that. So the jury's kind of out on that. We probably need a bit more research. The bit you're probably most interested in is this: can personality predict actual performance in sport? Well, here's the interesting thing. You would expect that it would, because personality influences how hard we're likely to want to work, and also how well we're able to cope, for example, with high pressure situations in sport. So you would think that it would be important, and yet studies with quite small samples don't seem to show much of this, but studies with large samples do show differences. So again, we see bigger differences between elite athletes and recreational athletes, for example, in addition to the ones between athletes and non-athletes. So as we get higher up the pyramid, elite athletes tend to be more extroverted and more stable than recreational athletes. And we also know that national and international competitors, higher level competitors, tend to be more conscientious and agreeable. So there is evidence that personality can lead to performance. On the other hand, personality measures don't seem to be useful in predicting, for example, the winner of a single match. There does seem to be a small effect when you look at personality in season-long performance. Not a big effect, but a significant effect that people with certain personality traits, you seem to be able to predict their likely success. So again, you might be looking at extroversion, for example, in a sport where you would think extroversion would be more important, and people tend to be more successful there. But it only really shows up when we look at long term. So, for example, one interesting study looking at whether people manage to progress from academy to pro football showed that personality traits seem to produce quite large effects, that by measuring personality you could actually predict who was likely to progress and who wasn't. So what that tells us is, on an individual basis, personality isn't that important, and on a short-term basis it's not important. But if you take a big sample of athletes, like the thousands of football academy players, for example, on average, athletes with certain personality traits are more likely to progress. But I must emphasize, this doesn't tell us anything about the likelihood of one individual progressing or not. It only works when we look at thousands of people. So personality consistently does have an effect, but we can't use personality to predict the success of an individual. There's just too many other things that are important in performance. We also know that personality seems to link to behaviours that associate with success. So we know that, for instance, conscientiousness links to the quality of your pre-contest preparation. We know that stability is associated with coping well. We know that conscientiousness and stability are linked to using problem-focused coping rather than avoidance coping, which is more effective. So problem-focused coping is where you tackle the problem head on to deal with it. Avoidance when you avoid it, which, as you can imagine, isn't really a very effective long-term solution. We know also a load of things that personality influences. For instance, extroverts play better in front of an audience than introverts. We also know anger appears to have a positive impact on the performance of extroverts, but it damages the performance of introverts. So there's all kinds of effects that are going on in terms of the links between personality and performance. We also know that personality is associated with exercise participation, and people that play sport, as I mentioned before, and people that don't. We know that extroverts are more likely to exercise regularly, and people who are high neuroticism are less likely to. But we need to consider a question here as well. A lot of justification for sport, for example, for pouring lots of money into sport in society and for school sport, is based around the idea that sport can have character building effects, that it can influence our personality. In actual fact, there's really very little evidence for that. There's a lot of claims about the pro-social effects of sport and the positive life lessons you learn. Actually, our personality really seems to be set by far more fundamental things than whether we play sport or not. And the evidence is more supportive of the so-called gravitational hypothesis that suggests that people with certain kind of personalities are more likely to want to play sport. So it's personality that influences participation rather than participation influencing personality. So we're going to spend some time in the seminar looking at some of these issues and the ins and outs of personality measurement in sport in more detail.